All right, in this lecture, I'm replacing the one on English fricatives I did before, but we're going to talk about fricatives, and this will probably be short and sweet because I'm not even sure if I'm going to run into problems with this one. So, as always, let me know what you don't understand in the warm-up, and I'm happy to talk through this in more detail in class. All right, our fricatives in English, we have 9 that we use. And we're going to talk about how they differ in terms of place of articulation, their voicing, and these two go sort of together, the force of articulation and how that affects the length of any vowel that comes in front of it. Right, our usual 4 points of contrast that we've been talking about with all of these different consonants so far. All right, so we have a bunch of different places of articulation to keep in mind when we talk about all of these fricatives. They differ all the way from labiodental to dental. So you can see these work from their way from the lips into the mouth, where we get further in the oral cavity with our alveolar sounds. And then we get to postalveolar. And our glottal sounds. And finally, even though I've given this before, I forgot to cross this off. This is just a repeat. All right, so those are all of our different places of articulation we're going to be covering here. And again, we're going to cover the same type of force of articulation, but if you just remember from before, our fortis or our strong sounds are always the ones that are voiceless, and our lenis or our weak sounds are voiced. All right, so that takes us to our voicing. And I'm going to write down the symbols. Our voiceless sounds that we're talking about here are or F. Then we have our voiceless TH, our S sound, sh, our sort of SH sound, and is also voiceless. So voice sounds would include V, V, Z. My comma didn't quite come out. Z. All right, and those are all of our fricatives broken down by whether the vocal folds are vibrating or not. And when you compare the length of the vowel, you're going to always have the same pattern appearing that we talked about before, where any type of open syllable, so li, if I transcribe this in IPA, we get li versus leaf and oops, and leave, although actually I don't want them in this order, so I'm going to write this differently anyways and draw the arrows to reflect that. All right, I'm going to put leave here. All right, so we want leaf down here at the end. So that if you look at all of these are the same vowel, E, but it goes from our longest vowels will be at this end, and they get progressively shorter as you go. So this is going to be the shortest vowel of all of these, just because you have a fortis consonant at the very end. You have this voiceless sound here. that shortens the vowel in front of it. Okay, so moving on to our different sounds. Review on your own the articulatory descriptions. We'll do more discussion of each in class as well, and viewing the videos on the OneDrive might also help you. But we're just going to go through and quickly name each sound. All right, and you already have most of the description here, but we're starting with, if you can hear that over my recording, our F sound, a voiceless labiodental fricative. Okay, so the only thing that's missing from the description here is the voicing. And I included the picture of this poor dog. If you want the funny, I don't know, it makes me laugh so hard I cry, this meme over Fricatives here, you can search on Google, but this little dog with his gross, meaning really large, underbite, it shows nicely that sort of F sound position. You have that lower lip making contact with the upper teeth, and that's how we produce that F sound. All right, so that's our voiceless labiodental fricative. In the same place of articulation, but different only by the voicing, is v. All right, so again, you have that lower lip touching your upper teeth, but this is a voiced labiodental fricative instead. All right, moving back a little bit more towards inside the mouth, we have our dental fricatives. But these are a little bit different than other sounds because we can actually sort of vary when we talk about the place of articulation. We're normally going to talk about them as dental sounds, sort of following the IPA chart, but there's some variation in how English speakers produce these sounds. This one is the sound as in the end of the word with. So if you think of that word, this sound is that represented by those letters TH at the end, and it's a voiceless dental fricative. So you can either produce it with that tongue making sort of light approximation with the teeth, or it could actually be what we call interdental, where the tongue sticks out a little bit between the teeth. So you can feel how you produce your TH sound when you say with. Do you sort of have your tongue within your teeth or sticking out between your teeth? It could be either way. But we're going to call this a voiceless dental fricative, but voiceless interdental fricative is okay and even more accurate in some cases. Our next sound is the voiced dental fricative, but it can also be produced interdentally as in with that tongue sort of sticking out between the teeth. And that's the sound as in the TH sound in front of the word the. All right. Now next we have our voiceless alveolar fricative, where the tongue is making a sort of close contact with that alveolar ridge, and it's the sound that you get that results from it. You know, unless you are, here this little meme is making fun of Sean Connery's Scottish accent, and maybe you put that tongue a little further back so it starts to sound more like shelf, as he might say. But that's our voiceless alveolar fricative. The same place of articulation, but with voicing added, is z, our voiced alveolar fricative. Right? And when you're actually snoring, we call that catching Z's, but the actual description of the letter Z is a voiced alveolar fricative. This description does not cover what you're actually doing when you snore. Something else we can talk about if you're interested. All right, a little bit further back in the mouth, we have our voiceless postalveolar fricative. This symbol sounds like shh. That's sort of that shushing sound that we can make, or you represent by holding your finger to your lips. That's a voiceless postalveolar fricative. Produced a lot like s, but the tongue is a little bit further back, and that tongue gets raised more towards the hard palate, changing the shape of that air channel. We're going to talk about some of those differences in the channel shape at the very end of the lecture. And the voiced counterpart to that sound is zh, our voiced postalveolar fricative. A pretty rare sound in English, mostly in words like measure or genre. Some people will say that word that way instead of genre, I think is also acceptable, but genre. Or a few other words in English that are mostly borrowed from French. And finally, all the way back down in your throat, we have the glottal fricative. It's called glottal because most of that fricative nature of that sound comes from turbulent airflow there through that sort of space, that glottis. We define that space as the glottis, the space between the vocal folds. So is our voiceless glottal fricative. All right, so now on to our channel shapes. And we're going to define all of these sounds we've talked about except for our voiceless glottal fricative, because that has nothing to do with the tongue. That's all has to do with what's going on there in the glottis. But all these channel shapes can be sort of defined according to what the tongue is doing, how it sort of shapes that flow of air through the oral cavity. And we can think of these shapes in terms of a few different choices. We can think about first our first classification. We can think of whether that channel is narrow or wide. And I find it sort of helps to think of like a waterway analogy. Think about whether that stream of airflow through the mouth, if it's like wide like a river or if it's kind of narrow like a little small creek. So we can talk about that. These sounds are either produced with a narrow or a wide air channel. And then we can think of another aspect of how these sounds are produced. Right? Is that body of water going to be very deep, or is it going to be kind of shallow? Right? How deep is the water in that, if you're using that waterway analogy? Right, so our deep ones are going to be considered grooved, or is it more of a slit type of channel? And that can be kind of visualized by whether there's like a large divot in the tongue. So maybe I will try a drawing here. All right, so if we kind of consider this box to represent, here's our tongue, and then here's sort of the sort of divot or little indentation we make into our tongue to shape that way that air is flowing through. So it can be either like a sort of a deep grooved sort of shape. So I'm going to fill this in. This is your tongue. Or maybe it's more of a slit. It's sort of, I'm going to try and have it cover the same sort of amount of area, but it's shallower on this one. So here we have our deep or our groove channel. Here is more of a slit or a shallow air channel. And so if you can conceptualize those different shapes, then you get an idea of how they connect. So for each one of these groups of sounds here, we're going to define both of these choices. And these sounds tend to work in pairs. So we have, according to the place of articulation. So we have s and ch and z, both of our alveolar sounds, our dental sounds, and z and sh and j, our postalveolar sounds here. All right, so I'm going to write down the descriptions for each of these. All right, so s and z are both narrow, and grooved. Our TH sounds happen to be both produced with a wide channel and a slit shaped, so relatively shallow. And our postalveolar sounds, sh and zh, are produced with a narrow channel that is also relatively shallow, so it's more of a slit shape. All right, so that gives us our different channel shapes. So when you look at the descriptions, I've given you more detailed slides. They cover both of those, but I thought it's also useful to sort of break it down into those two categories or choices to help you conceptualize like what these shapes exactly mean. All right, but you can also draw out these shapes. Here are just 3 of the 6 sounds we talked about, and sort of represent the same thing we talked about in just words. And why we are interested in these channel shapes is that there's something that children might mix up when they need to be taught the articulation. If there's some sort of articulation problem, you know, this might be the underlying reason why their sound's not coming out right. Because all of these shapes change that turbulent airflow. So if you have a relatively wide and sort of shallow shape, like those TH sounds, the air isn't quite as turbulent as when you compare it to an S sound, where you have a really narrow channel for that air to travel through, and it's kind of deep and grooved. So that produces much more turbulent, or as it looks here in this picture, curly airflow. But that, you know, is an important effect on the sound and something that is important to be aware of as a speech pathologist in order to help inform how you treat these articulation disorders. All right, so that's the end of the short and sweet fricative lecture. Let me know what questions you have in the warm-up, or if there's more information if I decide to re-record this lecture yet again. Hopefully it all worked the way it should have.